Good morning. I'm going to dive right in. I just want to acknowledge that my colleague and co-investigator on this project, Bonnie Fisher, was unable to be here today and regrets that she doesn't have the exciting opportunity to share the findings with you. So this was a two-part study, and the first part was that we conducted a web survey at the government systems level, at the state level, of agencies across the country. We wanted to learn more about what the infrastructure was that existed that can support or advance researcher-practitioner partnerships. Obviously, criminal justice systems don't work in the cliched vacuum. We wanted to have a better understanding of what goes on at the state level to support or advance these partnerships. And this component of the study actually was developed because as we were developing our grant application, we were searching for information on the web. And we couldn't find any one source that could help us understand even who to contact within each state who's responsible for the conduct of research. So this component really grew out of a gap that was identified as we were developing the second component of the grant application. But the web-based survey was conducted to learn about the infrastructure as well as specific experiences with violence against women issues. That's what VAW stands for. The second part of the project is where we interviewed researchers and practitioners about their experiences in successful partnerships. So what I'm going to report to you in the second part of this talk is about the barriers and facilitators within successful partnerships. We interviewed practitioners, and those were defined as those folks who were employed by the criminal justice system, as well as those folks who worked on the front lines providing services to those who interfaced with the criminal justice system, victims, offenders, obviously. We also interviewed administrators at the government systems level to get a sense of their experience and their take on researcher-practitioner partnerships and successful collaborations. Last, of course, we interviewed researchers, and those of us who are researchers-practitioners wanted this own category, or this category created for them. We interviewed those folks as well. So I'll begin with the web-based survey results. First of all, how many people participated in the study and how many had collaborated? We were very thrilled to have representation from 47 states. I promise not to stick out those 3 states who did not respond, but if you did not respond, we would still love your information. So we had representation from 47 states, and 55% of the respondent organizations had engaged in collaborations in the last 5 years. So that was just the last 5 years, the 55%. And there was an average of 5.5 collaborations per agency that had collaborated. And so I apologize, this is a dense slide. I know all of the rules about doing this, but I couldn't help it. It's the only dense slide there is. I'm a visual person. So we asked, I'm going to cover 3 points about the surveys. I'm going to talk about the facilitators to developing a collaboration, the barriers to developing a collaboration, and then importantly, what products result. In terms of the facilitators, what you can see here, the orange bar is what's most helpful when we asked what factors were helpful to developing a collaboration. And what you can see is that funding was available. I mean, this is kind of a no-brainer. You need funds to have a collaboration and develop a project. Second was the availability of the researcher. That was a facilitator to developing a collaboration. Now, a lot of us take this as a given, but as Jeff identified in his talk, there's not always someone who's in close proximity to the agency that wants to collaborate. Perhaps there's not a researcher who's interested. And there's also this other piece that actually, has been my personal experience, but I didn't realize for how many people it was